Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. Today, our guest is Scott Zamurut. Scott is a practitioner and teacher of somatic and energetic healing arts with over 33 years of experience in the field. His training background includes massage therapy, polarity therapy, private mentoring and structural integration, group leadership and dynamics, and ontological coaching, all of which support his current work in biodynamic craniosacral therapy and pre- and perinatal education and healing. Scott entered his teaching path in 1990 with polarity therapy. As a student and teacher trainee in the first biodynamic craniosacral therapy training with Franklin Sills, Scott is amongst the longest tenured teachers in North America. He was also fortunate to work extensively in the pre- and perinatal field with Carlton Terry, who mentored directly with William Emerson. These two streams of healing work are alive as the core focus of Scott's healing and teaching practice. Scott served as a founding board member of the Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy Association of North America and is a past vice president of the American Polarity Therapy Association. He's currently based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Scott, a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Keith.
We always are curious about people's personal stories, and maybe we can jump off right there. We're just wondering if you can give a brief or a bit of your story specifically. Why did you get into the healing arts and how did it lead you to practicing biodynamically?
Okay, that's a great question. So my original work in life back in the 1980s was in the audio retail business. So basically selling stereo equipment, televisions, VCRs, that whole thing. And got to a certain point and a certain level of that when I was living in Boulder, Colorado. And the company I worked for went through a large restructuring. And I was one of the folks who got restructured. So I went out to California with a friend on a vacation, which had been previously planned. And on the way back, we were driving through Wyoming in February. Wyoming in February is very cold and can be extraordinarily windy. And we were driving one afternoon outside of Laramie, and all that day we had been seeing tractor trailer trucks laying on the side of the road. And this thing, it's really quite crazy up there sometimes. And right outside of Laramie, I'm coming back to where I live and don't know what I'm going to be doing for a living. My career in audio sales is over. And so in that very open place, I hear a voice, literally, in my left ear, which says, go to massage school. And that was not on my radar in any way, except for the fact that I had worked as a practice client for someone in the Comey therapy training the prior fall, and had been getting polarity therapy sessions from a friend of mine. And so, I had never considered the healing arts as a direction to go, but one day outside of Laramie in the cold and the wind and the clouds of Wyoming in the winter, there was the sense of direction. Got back to town, got a hold of the massage school, and lo and behold, the following Monday, there was a open house. So I go to the open house and talk to them about massage school, but also polarity therapy, because that did have my attention a little bit. And beginning of May, I was in school studying polarity and studying massage. Polarity therapy really was my main interest. Massage was just a kind of a pathway, if you will. But the energetic aspect of polarity was what really had my attention. And part of polarity therapy and there's a bigger story here, of course, is craniosacral therapy. And so it's already embedded within. And then when my teacher, Franklin Sills, came from England, he came in the context of presenting to polarity conferences. So there's the cranial work as sort of a seed within polarity. And I just followed the breadcrumbs. So that's the short version of it.
Thanks, Scott. I wonder if you could help clarify for our listeners here about what it is that makes biodynamics distinct from other forms of craniosacral work, just to get that in at the start of our conversation.
Okay. Well, cranial work has a long history going back into osteopathy. In fact, most somatic arts, hands-on arts in the Western world, the United States, Western Europe, often have roots in osteopathy. The biodynamic perspective comes from a student of William Sutherland's. Sutherland was the osteopath who sort of the mainstream developer of osteopathy in the cranial field, as they call it. One of his students, a gentleman named Roland Becker, who's also an osteopath, started to modify the language of the work, and he began to talk about biodynamic energy. And biodynamic means the activity of life. But Dr. Becker was sensitive to the emerging field of quantum physics. And so he brought in a recognition that some of the phenomena that his teacher was describing, liquid light within the body, these are energetic phenomena. And so he brought in the word biodynamic energy. Now, my teacher was highly influenced by Dr. Becker. And so he started using the term biodynamic craniosacral therapy to differentiate a form of the work that's very much focused on the energetic dimension, not just about, manipulating the bones of the head, which is kind of the common view people have of craniosacral therapy. So it's really to focus on the energetic dimension. And I think that's a big part of why we're having the conversation today.
Thanks for providing a general framework about that distinction between the biodynamic model versus other forms. Some people might be familiar with the term just craniosacral therapy, right? Not with the word biodynamic in there. And many people do this kind of training, particularly the CST or craniosacral therapy one, most notably from John Upledger. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you feel that those who do study other models of craniosacral work, especially the popular CST model, are missing something that biodynamics does provide?
Well, they're missing the complete picture that came out of the osteopathic world. A lot of the more mechanically oriented or manipulatively oriented forms of CST, it's almost like, Sutherland's work and teaching was like a river. And if you tap into the river at certain times, you get a certain perspective of what he was doing. And his work was mechanical and manipulative up until the mid-1940s. And you have to remember, he graduated from osteopathic college in 1900. So you can look at the history of the work, and it's, manipulative work and mechanical work, very detailed, of course. But it's not until towards the end of his life, actually, that he had experience that woke him up to the inner energy of the system as the agency of healing. And then again, it was his student who then gave it the name biodynamic. So when I have taught, I have a number of students now who have gone through Upledger-based trainings and other trainings of that nature. And part of the reason they come is because they recognize that they haven't learned the energetic dimension as fully as is available. Their understanding of anatomy is great, their work is fabulous, but they come looking for the piece they know is missing. It's a both and. people recognize that there's a missing piece, and I've learned over the years what that piece is, and offer that in the training.
Thanks, Scott. I'd really like to help bring this to life for our listeners, right? So
Sure.
this idea of the inner energy of the system, the energetic dimension. What's your experience as a practitioner? Say you're hands-on with a client, you're connecting to this additional dimension, right? This counterpart to the physical. How are you experiencing that? What's your read on the system? How's the information flowing to you, your sensing, etc.?
That's a wonderful question. So at the heart of cranial work and at the heart of biodynamic work is a fluctuation through the body called primary respiration. Some people call it the cranial rhythmic impulse. But basically, there's a slow, energetic breath that comes through the whole of the body, an inhalation cycle and an exhalation cycle. And there are different paces or waves to that. Without going into that in a lot of detail, my job essentially is to listen to that wave of energy breathing through someone's body, to listen and find the places where it's able to breathe freely through the tissue body. So this is really about an integration of energy and form. They're not separate. I listen, I feel where the body's breathing. I also feel where the body's not breathing, where this energetic breath is not able to move through fluids, tissues, and the energetic field surrounding the body. When those places come to my awareness, there is a self-healing process that occurs. So it's not so much about me then needing to intervene in a particular way. The intervention is really mostly through my awareness and recognizing when the energetic breath and its intelligence has come to a place, found an unresolved trauma of any kind, and will clear the energy that's still being held by our own life force. So our own life force acts to protect us as best as it can, whether it's something really physical like a car accident, whether it's emotional trauma, psychological, even what we could call spiritual. There's external energy that comes into our system, or energy generated internally through pathology. And we see a lot of that in the lungs these days because of the various lung illnesses that are going around. So internally generated energies, and our own life force is working to keep that contained as best as it can. But it doesn't always have the capacity to resolve these energies on its own. So the magic of being a practitioner is something in the presence that I bring or other practitioners bring in relationship to that energy initiates a healing process that's guided by the energy of our own body. That's the nutshell version of it. What it feels like is very different in every session. No two sessions are the same. Even if people have very similar situations, how their particular body work to hold those energies will be very different. And the process by which their body will resolve these external traumatic forces will look very, very different. And they also look different with different practitioners too. So it's very much a relationship-based healing process.
You use the word presence and awareness in response to that, and we're talking about energy a lot and the field, and a popular notion of that word might be the aura, for instance. What is this component that goes beyond energy? You used presence and awareness. I know that in the biodynamic literature, we have words like stillness. What's
Right.
going on there? How do we account for or talk about that which is even beyond form?
Well, it's relatively simple, at least after 30 or so years for me. So being present for me has two components. There's an energetic component and a physical component. On a physical level, it's about a physical relationship to Mother Earth. I mean, the three of us are all sitting, we're in a chair, and the gravity between the earth and our bodies keeps us from hitting our ceilings, our heads on the ceiling, right? So we have a relationship with the earth, which, of course, to scientists is still mysterious. But there's also a resonance between my body and the earth. My body is composed of the same elements. If we look at our bones are crystallized minerals embedded in a fascial matrix. Well, if I dig into the earth underneath my house, there's rocks, there's minerals in the earth. So there's a resonance, a very deep resonance there. So part of being present is being landed and aware of my own physical body, being present in my physical body, not having my thoughts wandering, not losing a somatic sense of myself on a moment-to-moment basis. Feet on the floor, sits bones on the chair. The other dimension of it is what we call the energetic midline. So the idea of a midline, or in yoga, it's called sushumna, the central axis of energy through the body, which seems to be the organizing center of the whole thing. So the other practice that we used in this work is an awareness of our own energetic center, along with an awareness of our somatic being in relationship to the earth. So being aware of my midline, we can think of it simply as a beam of light through the body. Being aware of my midline, being grounded, being aware of my soma in relationship to Mother Earth, these two factors come together as the ground of being present. Awareness requires some practice, some skill and repetition. To be aware of the breath of life breathing through the body takes some time. To be aware of different layers of anatomy, to be able to put my hands on someone's cranium and feel, well, there's skin, subcutaneous fascia, bones, membranes inside the skull, cerebrospinal fluid, and inside all that, there's a brain. And to be able to palpate and sense the different kinesthetic textures of the anatomy of the body, that's something as awareness which requires practice and cultivation. And then becoming aware of some of the different energetic states that we encounter. When I teach the work, I'm often sitting next to practitioner, student practitioner, student client on the table. And I'll say, what do you feel now? Describe to me what your perception is. And, I'll, in a sense, tune in along with them to help them, to give acknowledgement, to help them recognize different layers, things they might not be seeing yet. Many years ago, it was said that this work is passed from hand to hand. And so that requires, in the teaching of the work, someone who can perceive these things and literally help the students tune into them as well. The overall training takes 3 years because it requires that kind of time to develop perceptual skills. And, students come in with a whole variety of them, from one end of the spectrum to the other. How do we help them tune into these particular layers of the system anatomically, energetically, and so forth? It all takes practice. And that's part of the awareness we're cultivating. And of course, we can step back and say, well, awareness also seems to be a fundamental characteristic of what we can conveniently call consciousness.
You're speaking very beautifully there about the importance of our embodiment, right? As individuals, our connection into our body and to Gaia, to the earth, which I really appreciate. I'm intrigued. You mentioned the Nadi Shushumna, right? The vertical power current in the system. And of course, there's many other aspects of subtle anatomy that are viewed in different models and systems. We have the meridians in the Chinese system and the chakras in the Vedic system. I'm intrigued as to your thoughts, if you have any, as to your connection to those aspects of the system. Do you read them or see them in any particular way, or is that not so relevant for your particular work?
Well, actually, the final module of the foundation training is on the chakras and how to work with them within the context of biodynamic cranial work. The chakras are natural centers of organization for different frequencies of energy in the body. And they have physiological ramifications, emotional, and so forth. So we go through the whole training, and then that's the last piece that we do is we work with the 5 elemental chakras in turn, and to learn how the life energy breathes through them and how that healing process can occur in relationship to the chakras. The meridian system I don't work with, that's a whole study in and of itself, but I have trained a number of acupuncturists over the years, and they will feel, if you imagine the map of the meridian system in the body, they will feel the meridians breathing with the underlying energetic breath. And then I know some of them have worked specifically where they can start to tune into individual meridians breathing and use that as a doorway into sensing, well, which ones need to be worked on, and if they're blocked, that can open them. If they're overactive, it can tonify them. So it all fits together, all the different layers of the body, all the maps and models do intertwine at a certain level. But we also have to recognize that there can be a lot of complexity in learning, to teach the meridian system in the context of cranial work would be, I don't know, a 15-year project or so. But they do interface with each other. I think that's the key point I would make.
So you train a lot of people. It's in this particular approach to biodynamic cranial work, right? We work with people, more specifically, let's say energy healing is a general term, and we work with the field, the chakras a lot, other kinds of anatomy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, some people have a really hard time sensing the cranial rhythms, yet some of those very same people are very tuned into information that's very useful in the healing process. Like somebody might put their hands on someone else and feel no cranial rhythms, yet they are very empathic, or they have a lot of psychic perception, clairaudience, clairvoyance, whatever. What do you do as a teacher within the paradigm you're teaching when people are working with information that isn't from this more rhythmic aspect, but is useful information for the healing process?
Yeah, that's always a dance that we do. So part of it is to help people context the information they're getting. Oftentimes when people haven't had some sort of clear container of training, they're empathic, they're psychic, so forth, but sometimes it gets a little uncontained and unfocused. So sometimes, so part of the work is to help them begin to differentiate where are you getting your information from, how are you validating the information, and then how can you put it into use, in simple terms. The other part of it is that in the training, as we're teaching people to become more grounded, become more focused on their own core energetic organization, that also helps to bring focus to their inherent capacities. So people who have that, different pathways of perception, if you will, in part of the training, those things can come into focus for them in ways that become more useful. More, okay, I have this information, what do I do with it? Because a lot of times people who are empathic, and I've certainly seen this for years, they have the information, but then they're not sure how to apply it in a way that's effective for people. And I think all of us who are educating people in energetic work of different types, that's a big part of what we're doing, is we're giving people focus, we're giving people containment, and then the capacity to really bring what they can perceive to others in a manner that's effective. The other thing I'd say is that people who are sensitive generally will learn to feel the cranial rhythms over time. One of the big differences in the ways people are trained, there are a lot of trainings where you go, say, for a week, and you get your piece of paper and it says, yeah, I took a cranial training. A week isn't enough time to really learn, sometimes even to feel the rhythms. And so, when we have a 3-year training, there is the time to cultivate that depth of listening. Part of it too is also working with people both in class and in private sessions to help them resolve some of the traumas and so forth that they're carrying that may separate them from their own sensitivity. Sometimes people can't feel things because they need to clear some of their own shock first. So that also is a part of the training. Hey, let's help you do some of your healing so that you can be a more effective healer. And that's also foundational to the mix.
Now, this brings me, Scott, to this idea of differentiation. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to talk more on how, say we have a practitioner, we have a client, right? Mm-hmm. How is it that these systems are interacting? Are we looking for distinct differentiation? Are we looking for merging? What's that relationship, and how is it that a person as practitioner or trainee practitioner how their stuff, if you will, might get in the way when working with a client, or vice versa? Just intrigued about that dynamic.
Yeah. Well, we're not looking for merging, right? Because merging is a lack of boundaries. We are looking for resonance. So one way of thinking about this is that our human bodies are all basically the same. I mean, obviously taller, shorter, wider, narrower, there's unique differences, and yet under those, we all have the same number of ribs, pretty much. There's people with, cervical ribs on occasion, but our bodies are basically the same, and they all breathe in the same way. So when I'm working with a client, it's less about my personality or what I'm thinking being the ground of the work. When I'm grounded and I'm on my center, my client system starts to resonate with me. And it's underneath the level of personality. There's just that, hey, there's the life breath in me, there's a life breath in you, and they meet one another. And, my body and your body, same basic design. So there's layers of resonance there. And it's from that place that the meeting occurs. Now, if I'm carrying my unresolved stuff, and after 30 years, there's still plenty left to work on. And certainly my client is coming, because they have whatever their concern is. They got bitten by a dog or who knows what. So they have their concern. To the best of my ability, I set mine aside. And my client is on the table and they say, well, here's what's happening for me. So one example I had the other day is someone came who was getting headaches, dizziness, a little motion sickness, and they felt like the right side of their head was all clogged up. And it was both physically kind of stuck and not breathing, and then energetically stuck and not breathing. First thing that opened up was the suture between their temporal bone and occiput. And then as their temporal bone was able to breathe, the inner ear, which is deep in the temporal bone, which is both our hearing mechanism and our semicircular canals, which are balanced, as that bone started to breathe and also clear out energetically, their little bit of tinnitus went away and their dizziness went away. But the whole focus of the session was on the person on the table. My tinnitus didn't go away. My little bit of ringing, it's still there, unfortunately, but there you go. So the focus, the clarity of the session is I'm working on the person on the table, and my concerns step aside, their concerns come to the foreground. And again, because I'm not putting energy into them, I'm not trying to make something happen, but listening to the wisdom of their body at work, the session becomes about their body. Now, obviously, that's a very simple description. The idea of having to moment to moment to moment. Okay, am I grounded? Let me check in, be grounded again. Oh, what's happening in your temporal bone? Oh yeah, where's my midline again? Oh, okay, yeah, now things are breathing better. So there's also a dance of me needing to stay grounded, their system unfolding their healing process, and keeping a clear relationship. One of the things I tell my students, which I think is important to share, we talk about relationship in healing work. It's very rare for the average person to have an experience with another human being, to be with someone who's spending their time keeping their own personal stuff clear and just attending to the person who is the client. To have the experience of, wow, this person's doing nothing but staying grounded and listening to me, for 40, 50, 60 minutes. Just that aspect of the relationship is huge, because most people don't have that aren't met in that way in our culture. So just to be met in that way is huge for people. Never mind all the fancy anatomy and energetics. Just the very fact, yeah, I'm here for you. Truly skilled at being here for another person. So whatever the work is, whether it's my work or your work, whatever people are doing, that alone is a huge piece of, I think, what's happening in the container.
To switch gears slightly and kind of look under the practitioner's hood, really curious about your personal experiences. So, for instance, as a practitioner, what comes to mind if I ask this simple question? What's the most challenging situation you've ever had arise in a session as a practitioner? Either the most or one that comes to mind now.
Well, yeah, there are a few highlights. One category of difficult experiences is working on folks in hospitals, because I've had over the years opportunities to work on people in different situations when they were in the hospital. Now, obviously, that's a difficult environment to work in, especially, I've been in ICUs a couple of times. So, there's machines, there's tubes getting stuck in people's bodies, there's drugs being administered, that whole range of stuff. And in the midst of all that, I'm trying to stay grounded and listen to someone else's system. And there's a lot of interference, both directly with their body, the interventions that are happening, as well as the larger environment. Although I do have to say that whenever I've worked in a hospital, the nurses love having people come and do, even stuff they don't understand as healing work, because they know that there's validity to it. I mean, they see that. And on a practical level, that's one less person they have to keep peeking in on every 10 minutes, because they're overworked, really. But the most challenging session for me personally was doing a session in a private nursing home in Boulder many years ago when I worked up there. A friend of mine had a private nursing home and asked me to come work on one of the clients there. And this is someone, he was under hospice care at the time. And he had Lou Gehrig's disease, very, very advanced stage of it, not very communicative, not really communicative at all, elderly and, really at the end of life. And the challenge there was I kind of put my foot in my mouth. There was a hospice nurse and a hospice social worker in the room, and I told the nurse, well, he's just afraid to leave. And she looked at me very sweetly and said, well, if you can do anything to help, go ahead. That's not part of the training, really. We don't teach how to hold that container, right? The long and the short of it was I did work with him, and what became clear was there was one last piece that he needed to let go of. He had been in the military, that was his career. And there was a message that ended up coming through to him, through me to him, which was, you've been promoted. And he just needed to hear that, because he wasn't going to, as a good member of the military, he wasn't going to leave his post without permission, in a sense. And, and we're talking the very big sense of not leaving his post. But when the message came to me, and I was just like, oh, okay. And I just gave him that message through my hands. That was not an out loud. I felt his system was, it was fascinating, because in my mind going in, I thought, well, if someone's about to leave, there's not a lot of energy around. There's not a lot of vitality. Well, that was a mistake. There's a huge amount of energy, but his life energy couldn't stay in his body because of the disease process and, all of that. So there's a lot of energy around him in the field, but it couldn't stay embodied and sustain and heal and all of that. So, my first mistake was thinking, oh, it'll be really chill. It was not really chill. I was standing with my fingers on his ankles at the foot of the little hospital bed, shaking, because it was so intense. There was so much energy. But when I started to give him that message through my fingertips, very slowly, the whole intensity of energy just slowly, slowly, slowly settled down, settled down, settled down. And then there was one last energetic breath, and it came right up his midline, just as the books often describe, right up the midline, right out the top of his head. And I looked over at the nurse and the social worker who were still in the room with me, and they were both looking at me like, whoa. And afterwards, when we talked, they said, we'd never seen anything like that, what you did. And I was holding on for dear life, so to speak. But there was a message that this gentleman needed to complete. So that was the most challenging session that I had. But it was also, I learned a great deal about the reality of energy and the reality of what sustains our bodies. It's one thing to read in a book, oh yeah, this energy is breathing through the body and it sustains us. Yeah, sure, okay, great. It's another thing to feel it and then to feel it leave and go, oh, this is the energy that makes us alive. It's way beyond the books, way beyond words. So I share these words with you and, trying to point to an experience of, yeah, it's bigger than we can even talk about, really. But it also has given me a great clarity about what's true with life energy, with biodynamic energy, whatever, labels we like to slap on it. So that was my most challenging session.
Really resonate with what you're sharing there and the sacredness of that experience.
Yeah.
And also the importance, as you say, we can talk about this phenomenon, we can read about it, but the importance of the experiential, right? Clearly, you're very passionate in this subject, over 30 years now, dedicated I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the benefits of this work as you see them, the good that this work can do, and perhaps even a little bit here about why biodynamics is so relevant for trauma healing, if that feels appropriate for you.
Absolutely. I've worked with a lot of different circumstances. Everything from, hey, my shoulder hurts. A couple of weeks ago, I had, semi-regular client come in, still working through shoulder pain. They do body work. So, there's that, and they do yoga a lot. So, there's ongoing input into their system. And we had a wonderful session where it got down to the tension pattern was being held in the periosteum of the long bones of their arm, which is the fascial covering of the bones. So that's where the tension pattern was that they were experiencing every day. And when their system got down to that layer, it's like their bones melted and opened up. So on a very physical level, this work can be quite remarkable for chronic pain, specific pain patterns. I work on folks who have had hip replacement, knee replacement, things like that. What can be done through surgery these days is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. But, when they put it back together, it's not quite where it was before. But when we can get the life energy breathing through the body and even breathing through the new parts, which is fascinating, people have a different relationship. Whatever leftover pain and whatnot, misalignment from their surgery clears. But in a certain way, their new parts become a part of them, even though they're not living parts. They're titanium and plastic and whatnot, but they become integrated in a certain way. It's almost like the life energy can accept, okay, I have a fake hip, but it's working really well, and I'm going to go through my life with it, which is, that's a fascinating place to work with people. Headaches, migraines, things of this nature, anything resulting from surgery. I have worked a lot with people, different kinds of surgeries and so forth. Quick example, working on someone years ago who had arthroscopic surgery for a knee replacement, and during one of their sessions, they re-experienced the surgeon putting the holes in their knee to do the surgery. So the trauma of having someone drill holes in their body, and that is traumatic, even though the end result is happy, that was able to clear out of their system. So huge range. Certainly emotional and psychological clarity can come as trauma is resolved. A way to explain that is the system gets to a place where not only, we talk about getting triggered by situations. We get into situations and we get triggered, and there's emotional reaction and biochemical reaction. Our systems can be clarified to the point where they no longer respond or react to things that in the past would have been, thrown people over the edge. And I know that internally from my own experience of receiving the work as well as, doing the work with other people, that literally the whole pattern of reactivity can be resolved. And it is gone from the body. It's like the body can't go there, the mind can't go there, the emotional body's like, nah, I can't even react to this. Trauma, in this view of the body and healing, is always about energetic forces primarily. And the energetic forces will then organize the nervous system in certain ways. So, nowadays in the trauma world, there's, the vagus nerve has a great PR team. We hear a lot about the vagus nerve. We hear a lot about polyvagal theory. We hear, all the different neurological views, and they're all accurate. In energetic work and biodynamic work, we go underneath body physiology to, well, what's the energetic dynamic that's causing the vagus nerve to be off its normal physiological function? Well, that's this energetic input that came with a particular trauma or insult. So earlier I talked about how in biodynamic work, the inherent energy of the body is working to clear traumatic energies that have come in from different events. And this can go all the way back to before birth, by the way. So, it's a broad scope. When these energies are resolved from the body, and sometimes, it takes time, it's not always an instant thing. When these energies are resolved, body physiology comes back into its optimal state of function. So that means the vagus nerve starts functioning as it's designed to. That means the sympathetic nervous system is able to reset itself at lower and lower levels of activation. Someone comes out of car accidents and so forth, their sympathetic nervous system, you drop a feather on them and it terrifies them. The energy underlying that activation gets resolved out of the system, and then they return to a healthier and healthier level of sympathetic tonus. We need a sympathetic nervous system, but it doesn't have to be so nervous all the time. But it's through the resolution of these energies that trauma, as we understand it, neurologically, psychologically, emotionally, when the energetic underpinning is resolved, the behaviors, the thoughts, the reactivity to the world, that all shifts. All levels of that will shift. The term is down-regulate, right? All of those levels will shift because the underlying energy that's held the patterns in place over time gets resolved. So trauma is really inherent in all healing, because all healing is about, well, there's some sort of trauma, there's some sort of energetic input, whether it's, a physical event, whether it's something that happened during our incarnation journey. The beauty of working energetically is we sort of work under the story. We don't have to, kind of therapize the story or process the story. We resolve the energy. And then the story has no foundation anymore. And, certainly people will want to talk it out and so forth, but at a certain level, it just vanishes. And we're left with, oh, well, here we are. And again, I want to acknowledge that I'm, saying this in shorthand, really, because the actual process of healing as I'm describing it, again, it's not a one-time deal. It's not like one session and all your trauma is gone and you're a Buddha and you live happily ever after. It's an ongoing journey for all of us in a unique way. But I think the idea that there is an energetic underpinning to it all, and that if we're working energetically, ultimately that's what we're looking to meet and clear from people's systems.
Thank you, Scott. Particular question about almost comparing models in a way. One from like classical auric structure versus biodynamic. And you mentioned at the beginning, we didn't get into it, but you mentioned at the beginning about how the cranial rhythms have deeper levels of potency or deeper levels of organization. And these are classically called, the cranial rhythm, and then we go into mid-tide, long tide, et cetera. And they get longer and longer, right? Longer and longer. And the longer tides are said to have more organizational potency, like they're more powerful, they're more formative. Now, that's in contrast, in certain sense, with traditional notions of how the energy field is organized. So, for instance, in field dynamics, we would talk about something like the different levels of your field being different dimensions, and that they're actually, as you go higher in the dimensions, things actually get faster, and those higher dimensions are actually inclusive of those that are below. Okay, so in a certain sense, we're saying things get faster as they're actually more formative. So I'm wondering about this contrast between the biodynamic perspective and a traditional auric perspective. How do we resolve these two, or just what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think the fundamental thing is that the frequencies that are being talked about in auric work are different frequencies than the tidal rhythms that we talk about in biodynamic work. So if we're talking about, energy per se in the field, yeah, the model is that finer vibrations are closer to source, I think is what congruent with what you're saying. But in biodynamic work, the tide, as we're talking about it, these different rhythms, fundamentally, the tide is about the formation and the ongoing sustenance and transformation of body physiology. So these rhythms aren't just rhythms energetically, they're rhythms specifically in relationship to each unique embodiment. And this is a really important thing, because there's sometimes a tendency to take the tide, the mid tide or the long tide, the 5-minute tide, and kind of universalize them. Well, this is a universal energy breathing through everything. That's not actually the case. I have tides breathing through my body that make me alive. And this is one of the things I learned really clearly from that session I did that we just talked about. There are rhythms in my body that make me alive, rhythms in your bodies that make you alive. We all have the same rhythms, and yet the rhythms in me are about this body. And at a certain point, they will breathe back to another dimension. Higher vibration, different dimension, mysterious to us here, certainly. But the tide is unique to my particular body physiology, my expression of life. And so, yeah, they're deeper and slower, and perhaps more potent, or at least they seem to work in different ways. As a side note, on a in a practical level during a session, I don't choose which tide I'm looking at or working with. I let the body choose. This is really important. So I'm not looking for, well, I'm going to only work with the really slow ones because they're cooler. It's like, no, I work with what this body needs to show me for its healing process today. So for me, that's a really important point. But the tide is unique to my embodiment as a living being. A Lakota teacher once explained it this way. They said, if you think of the creator as a campfire, which makes sense for their culture, we're all a little spark that's kind of flown off the main fire, right? And the spark has its time, and then that spark goes away. So that's kind of our own unique thing. I think with auric field and when we're getting into those energies, I mean, certainly they relate to us individually, but then there's also the more universal interconnectivity of those high frequencies of one person to another, and then more, say, universal interconnections that exist. So I think the best thing to do is to keep them separate, to not see them as the same kinds of frequencies. Of course, from a whole other perspective, all of this might not mean anything at all, but there we go.
I love this idea of breathing back to a different dimension. Really poetic.
Yeah, that's something that the osteopaths talked about for years, since they would often attend to people at the end of life. And the recognition that, yeah, well, we just breathe into a different dimension.
I know we could talk to you for much longer than we have been. We're coming towards the end of our time. We like to ask our guests to share if they potentially have any stones unturned in their career or in their life at this stage. You've obviously achieved a great deal. If there's anything on the horizon for you that you'd like to approach or to take on.
Well, on a fundamental level, one of the things I've recognized this year is this fall will be 30 years since I began my formal training in this work and my teacher training. And so I've spent 30 years doing this. And I say this jokingly with my clients, I'm getting good at it. It feels like I'm pretty consistent as a practitioner, some good clarity as a teacher. I'm really curious about the next 30 years. What happens within my healing work? What happens within my teaching work? There are stories of people in their 90s who were still teaching, still practicing. They had been working for 50 or 60 or more years in this work. And what the evolution of their experience meant for them. And I'm still excited, as you noticed earlier, and I'm very curious what happens with another 10 years and another 10 years after that. Where does this work go? It's way more interesting than what's happening on television. It's a fascinating path. I don't foresee a major deviation. For me, one of the big pieces that I've recognized over time is that it continues to deepen. Everything about it just continues to deepen. The different experiences I have, some of which I've shared, the ways in which I see students responding to the teachings, where my feeling is students are learning more efficiently, getting more clear in their journey as practitioners, much more readily than 10 or 20, 25 years ago. So all of that to me is still fascinating territory. Maybe the thing that holds the most curiosity is, what is the potential and capacity of this work in maybe more challenging health situations, right? So as time goes on, and I've worked on people with different disease processes, different trauma processes and so forth, to see the capacity of the work unfold and to have the opportunity to bring it to different people, different situations, and see what the potential is over time. One of the arenas I've talked about is, our early experiences of, the process of coming here, of incarnating, and how more and more working with people in these arenas creates a clarity in someone's life that is really remarkable to witness. On the other hand, what about some of the disease processes that are happening now, and what people are suffering with, or even the a particular one would be long-term COVID, and the situations that are arising in people's bodies, where there's a lot of somatic work that we can do to free up people's lungs. After they've been sick for a long time, there's a lot of fascial stuff happening there, a lot of energetic stuff. But just to work there has a lot of fascination for me. Never mind other situations as well. So yeah, there's so much more to come.
If someone wants to work with you, Scott, how do they find you? You do have a website,
I do
scottzamurut.com.
have a, yeah.
And what is it that you're doing in terms of upcoming things and in general, like what's your training like? You mentioned it was 3 years
Yeah.
long, and what would you want to share with people who are listening to this who might want to find you and do some work?
Well, they can find me via the website, scottzamurut.com. I do have a new training coming up later this year. So there will be an introductory class in August, and that information will go onto the website in the next few days. And then the training itself it takes place over a 3-year period. It consists of 4-day modules, and we meet once every 3 months in person. And then there's reading, anatomy studies, and practice in between those modules. 13 modules every 3 months. We start at the end of 2023 and we graduate in 2026. But, it's not full-time school, obviously, but it's time to integrate. It's one thing to have experiences in the classroom, then you have to go home and integrate, you have to practice, you have to read and learn more, and then you come back for another round. And that, for me, that training model has been very, very helpful. So there will be information about the dates and the cost and all of that. It's certainly a training for people who are dedicated. It's not a simple thing. It's not a weekend or two. You get your piece of paper and go running out in the world. There's a lot of anatomy study, so that can be very scary for people. But we do it in it's not just about stuffing our mind with pictures from anatomy books. It's, here's the anatomy, let's go feel it. Here's the anatomy, let's feel it. So it's all about integrating and embodying a relationship to living anatomy in other people. And then we go through, here are the different energetic states, the different tides that we feel. And we spend 3 years learning to feel them. So the idea is that you're not getting a little tidbit of understanding and running out into the world. It's working to deepen people's capacity right from the get-go. So to learn the different tides that we work with in biodynamics, to learn the anatomy, to learn to recognize the different energetic interactions that are part of the healing process. And, once people get started, people who are really into it keep doing it. It's a lifelong process, and I'm sure you both are as involved as I am in your own way and in your own work. You're not going to suddenly become a shoe salesman or something. So for people who are really dedicated and for whom some of these ideas and stories and experiences resonate, we do have the intro class so people can get a taste of it. They get a taste of, here's Scott as a teacher and his teaching staff, and here's what the experience in class is like for a few days. So, someone can come to that and get the experience and then really decide to go forward from there. And, I think that's important in this kind of thing. But ultimately, my goal is to train people to do this work in the world. And, when I studied with my teacher, Franklin Sills, I remember really clearly at a certain point, I was like, I want to learn to do what he does. That was kind of my guiding inspiration, because I could see that there was skill and understanding and so forth there. And so my hope is to find a bunch of folks who look at me and my teaching staff and say, I want to learn to do what they're doing out of their own deep inspiration, not just because they think it's a good idea, but because their heart's like, yeah, this is something important. Because the more people we have doing this work or any kind of healing work, we need it.
Really important sentiment.
Yeah.
Thank you. for taking the time today and joining us.
Yeah.
Sharing your energy, sharing your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend time with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Likewise.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott. Really appreciate everything you've shared.
Thank you. It's wonderful to share, and I appreciate the questions. They've obviously gotten my spark going today.
Thanks for listening to the episode. What really supports the podcast is providing a rating and review of the show on your preferred listening platform. This helps us get the message out to a wider audience. If the topics we discussed today appeal to you, do take a moment to subscribe. Lastly, we invite you to check out our website, fielddynamicshealing.com, to learn about our training programs, private session work, and to see how we're setting the standard in contemporary energy healing. Many thanks, and see you next time.